I can't see. I think he just touched somebody with his handlebar there, but his chain is off. His chain is stuck, and it's a complete and utter chaos at the back end of the bike race. Can he recover?
The adrenaline will be pumping now like you will not believe here.
Hi guys, my name is Jake Brown, and today we're going to be looking at what is in a champion, really exploring the science of doping in sports. Let's get going. Alright, so doping, a little etymology to start. Dope is originally a Dutch word. It described the name of an alcoholic beverage that was used by Zulu warriors to enhance their performance in battle. Pretty interesting. So later it actually referred to the illegal drug use of horses, race horses, and obviously today it refers to performance-enhancing drugs used by humans in sport. Here's a definition just of doping. This was proposed by the Council of Europe in 1963, which was just before the first anti-doping legislation took place. So just read it here real quick. Making use of physiological substances in immoderate quantity or abnormal method by healthy people whose only aim is to obtain an artificial increase in performance during competition. So with that, let's get going in. Check out the purpose and outline here. Alright, so my purpose in this presentation is to present to you a scientific overview of the physiology of different types of doping and just provide a short history as well. So as you can see, an outline of the presentation will start with a brief history of doping in sport, followed by going over the scientific uses, risks, and testing of certain types of PEDs. Hopefully we can get through them all today. So let's get to it. So we'll start with a brief history of performance-enhancing drugs. Kind of the first name associated with performance-enhancing drugs was Choppy Warburton. He was an English cycling team manager back in 1896 and was responsible for doping 3 individuals who all died from trimethyl doping. That's a combination of the stimulants caffeine, cocaine, and strychnine. We'll get into stimulants in just a little bit. In 1904, the St. Louis Olympics, that was the first Olympics ever in the modern era, the marathon champion Thomas Hicks actually doped the whole race with strychnine injections, raw egg, and brandy. He was thought that was the only way that he could finish the race is if he actually used those methods of doping. Pretty crazy. In the 1924 Tour de France, 3 French brothers, the Pélissières, told a journalist, quote, "We run on dynamite," referring to strychnine and other stimulants that they were using. In fact, in the 1930s, the Tour de France organizers had to say in the rulebook that they would not be providing the drugs during the race, that athletes would need to provide their own. In the 1940s, anabolic steroids were first developed by Eastern Bloc countries and used to gain a competitive advantage in weightlifting. That was their first use. In 1960s, countries started to recognize the negative effects of doping, and France in 1964 passed the first anti-doping legislation of any nation. Soon in 1966, both FIFA for soccer and UCI for cycling both passed anti-doping laws and soon instituted testing very soon after that. And then in 1967, the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, developed the first banned substances list. And first, this just had basically stimulants on it, but by 1976, they put anabolic steroids on the list, and after the first clinical trials for EPO use occurred in 1986, they put EPO on that banned substances list as well in 86. In 1998, a Tour de France scandal with a police raid and everything revealed huge rampant doping problems. This led to the formation of the World Anti-Doping Association, also called WADA, because different countries really didn't have the same sort of punishments in place for doping, so they had to kind of conform, to one strict measure of how are we going to enforce doping legislation. So that's why WADA was formed. But let's get to the science. So getting right into stimulants. Stimulants include things like caffeine, amphetamines, strychnine, modafinil, ephedrine, and bromanthane. These generally take effect on the central nervous system, so the brain, and they affect the senses. So they're not really making it physiologically easier for your body to complete an event, but they're affecting your sense of how things are happening. So for instance, they increase your sense of excitement and your sense of alertness, and they decrease your sense of fatigue, but they're not actually like increasing oxygen transport. So it makes it easier to gut it out mentally, really. Okay, so here let's take a look at kind of an example mechanism of how these work. Bromanthane and cocaine both work in this way as dopamine and serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And here's dopamine as a reuptake inhibitor. You can see here's our reuptake channel here, and here's the reuptake inhibitor. This is a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, and this is how your brain sends messages between neurons. All right, those are kind of the unit of sending messages in the brain. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter which communicates with the first neuron and the second neuron, and it kind of travels across here and binds to this receptor and allows an action potential of the communication signal to propagate along the second neuron. So when dopamine is blocked from getting reuptaken into the presynaptic neuron, it stays in the synaptic cleft longer and makes it easier for your body to become excited, for your body to become kind of like ready and alert. So this is how a stimulant might work. Now, what you really probably are interested in is caffeine, right? Caffeine works a little bit differently. Its mechanism in that is it blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine is a molecule that contributes to drowsiness in the brain. So by blocking this, caffeine keeps you more awake, right? Caffeine's also been shown to improve endurance performance. Lane and colleagues in 2014 demonstrated a 4% improvement in power output during a simulated cycling time trial when caffeine was taken 40 minutes beforehand. But this effect may only be on sub-elite athletes, not elite athletes. That's been shown by research by Smokla and Kumstad just last year. Now, what you're probably really curious about is coffee. If I drink coffee, will it make me go faster? Well, research by Hodgson and colleagues in 2013 found that coffee and caffeine taken in the same quantities of total caffeine 1 hour before a competitive event had the same effect on endurance performance. So as long as coffee doesn't cause you some gastrointestinal distress, it might be worth trying to drink a cup of coffee a little bit before your next event. So human growth hormone, more commonly known as HGH. Recombinant human growth hormone was first discovered in 1981. Recombinant means that they take a human gene for something like a hormone, they put it in a different animal or another vector, and then they use that animal to mass produce that hormone, which they can distribute for medical use. For instance, originally to combat dwarfism. But athletes say it, quote, improves performance. However, the research doesn't necessarily show that. A meta-analysis by Liu and colleagues in 2008, in fact, showed that HGH increases lean body mass and fat oxidation, but it hasn't been found to increase strength, and it may even lower exercise capacity because it leads to higher lactate production in the muscles. Yaroshevsky and colleagues in 1993 found a similar thing when they tested weightlifters with HGH. They found that any sort of hypertrophy, increase in lean muscle mass associated with HGH use wasn't actually due to hypertrophy of the structural components in muscle, but it was due to increased fluid retention of the muscle. Some side effects of human growth hormone include that soft tissue edema. So again, the accumulation of fluid, just like Yaroshevsky found in the muscle, can also occur in the soft tissues, resulting in edema. Chronic use of HGH can lead to symptoms similar to acromegaly, which Andre the Giant suffered from, a pituitary disorder in which too much HGH is produced. Now in this case, you're not producing too much HGH, you're just using too much, so the symptoms would mirror acromegaly. Testing for HGH is extremely difficult and extremely expensive. The first tests were developed in 2004, before the Olympics, but again, because it's so expensive and so difficult, testing is not very widely used, and it's easy to get away with HGH use, but again, something that hasn't been shown to actually increase performance. Beta-2 adrenergic agonists. What do? Beta-2 adrenergic receptors are bound by epinephrine under sympathetic nervous system activity. So that's the fight or flight response. For instance, if you see a bear, and what happens in that fight or flight response is you have increased vasodilation and increased bronchodilation, so it's easier for you to breathe and easier for you to pump that blood around your body. Vasodilate means the blood vessels get wider. Bronchodilate means the vessels in your lungs that house air actually get wider, right? So medically, these used to be used for things like asthma and pulmonary disorders, but since then they've actually found that the use of beta-2 adrenergic agonists actually doubles your chance of respiratory death. So really, they're not used so much in these kind of things anymore. Fisher and colleagues in 1988 actually showed different effects of beta-2 adrenergic agonists, that they're not limited to just broncho and vasodilation, that they actually are released under hypoxic conditions and cause erythropoietin release. Now we'll get to erythropoietin, also called EPO, a little bit later, but basically it's going to increase the oxygen carrying capacity in muscles. So if it increases oxygen carrying capacity, obviously that's going to be really beneficial to endurance athletes. So we see use of beta-2 adrenergic agonists really all across sports, and one that's really common that we've seen is called clenbuterol. Clenbuterol is kind of an inhaler type drug. It has been shown to increase O2 transport, central nervous system activation, increases basal metabolic rate, and fat oxidation as well. We've seen that, like I said, across all sports, including canoeing, Major League Baseball, swimming, the Mexican national soccer team, and cyclist Alberto Contador. Moving on to testosterone and SARMs. All right, testosterone. Obviously, testosterone, as you know, probably is a naturally produced hormone. It's produced by the prostate gland in men, and women may produce a little as well. How it works is it's fat soluble, so it diffuses through the cellular membrane into the cytosol and binds its androgen receptor. Remember that, androgen receptor. Androgen is the class of hormone that testosterone is. So it binds to its androgen receptor, and this complex diffuses into the nucleus and then alters gene expression. And altering gene expression results in increased protein synthesis, and that results in tissue repair, tissue recovery, and also building up of muscles. We need protein for all those things. However, the problem with administering testosterone, say for like a testosterone deficiency, or athletes have this problem if they're doping with testosterone, is that taking too much unnatural testosterone reduces the body's ability to produce it naturally. It has that negative feedback, right, on the prostate gland. All right, so in order to combat this problem, SARMs have been developed, or selective androgen receptor molecules. So with these molecules, they're just targeting the androgen receptors in specific tissues like muscle and bone. So they don't go and they don't act on the prostate, right? They only act on the androgen receptors in muscle and bone, so they don't have that negative feedback. Really important. Barry Bonds, a baseball player for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Here you can see him in his rookie year in 1986. Later on in 2000 with the Giants. You can see a big size change in the amount of muscle volume he has. As you probably know, Barry Bonds was a heavy user of anabolic steroids. We're going to get into steroids right away. Anabolic androgenic steroids, or AAS, more commonly known as just anabolic steroids, but they are called androgenic because they mimic the effects of testosterone, an androgen hormone, remember. So we just learned about testosterone. You might be wondering, what makes steroids different, right? Well, what makes steroids different is we're trying to focus on the anabolic effect, right? So they're a similar molecule to testosterone. In fact, they have the same mechanism, but they try to have a low androgenic to anabolic ratio. So they try to have a lot more anabolism effects than they have androgen effects. If a steroid is used just for testosterone replacement therapy, then we're going to have a high androgenic to anabolic ratio. But if it's used in something like doping, athletes are really trying to emphasize this anabolic part. It's also been shown to block cortisol's catabolic effect on muscle during recovery. So in that way, it also contributes to muscle anabolism, muscle buildup. But really interesting studies have been done just recently by Harridge and Caddy, and they showed us first something we already knew, that like testosterone, steroids increase nuclear transcription, resulting in increased muscle protein synthesis of those structural components. But additionally, steroids have been found to increase muscle cell nuclei numbers. It actually causes muscle cells to borrow more nuclei from nearby satellite cells, which increases muscle memory. So when an athlete stops using steroids, the effects, the muscle memory, still are there. So this may have really big implications for governing bodies of sports, trying to make punishments for players. You know, if a player stops using steroids, their effect of using steroids still continues for many, many years because they're always going to have those nuclei. Their muscles are going to remember how to build muscle. Side effects of steroids, we've all heard these many times before. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through them, but you can take a look. Testing basically is gas chromatography, mass spectrometry of the urine. Basically what they're doing is they're breaking down the components of the molecules in the urine and doing a chemical analysis on them in order to figure out what components are in the urine. Very common chemical analysis there. So moving on to a pretty interesting one, recombinant erythropoietin, also called EPO. It's a naturally occurring hormone produced by the kidneys under hypoxic conditions. So when you're exercising, your muscles say, hey, we need to do a better job of transporting oxygen more efficiently. How do we do this? We release EPO from the kidneys. EPO acts on the bone marrow, specifically the hematopoietic stem cells, and it causes those HSCs to differentiate into reticulocytes, or immature red blood cells, which then turn into erythrocytes, or red blood cells, RBCs. And RBCs carry hemoglobin, which carry oxygen. So if you coddle that, you'd see that EPO increases your body's ability to carry oxygen. Really important. So it's used medically to treat anemia and end-stage kidney disease when either in anemia you don't have that hemoglobin, or in end-stage kidney disease you can't produce that EPO. So what's really interesting though is that not all the effects on exercise capacity from EPO can be attributed to its erythropoietic effect. What this means is that there must be other things that EPO is doing. There must be other EPO receptors out there, and they have found an EPO receptor on muscle. Pretty interesting. So that's what Christensen and colleagues tried to do in 2012, figure out what this do, and they found that it increases resting energy expenditure, REE, but they didn't really know how because they didn't see any increase in glucose metabolism or insulin sensitivity. So they hypothesized that it must have something to do with either uncoupled thermogenesis or something to do with fat oxidation. Guadalupe and Grau, just in March of this last year, jumped off of Christensen and colleagues and found that yes, EPO does increase mitochondrial fat oxidation, and it also increases the concentration of myoglobin. And both these things obviously don't have anything to do with the increase in hemoglobin, but they do contribute to an increase in exercise capacity. So pretty interesting stuff. Lance Armstrong. I'm sure many of you have heard of Lance, 7-time Tour de France champion, now 0-time Tour de France champion, thanks to doping from EPO. First blood sample from 1999, once they came out with a direct blood test for EPO in 2001, that sample tested positive. However, the evidence was rejected by UCI, cycling's governing body, lawyer, for improper procedure followed by the testing body, by WADA. However, in 2012, enough evidence was finally accumulated, and the U.S. Anti-Doping Administration found Lance guilty of a number of things: use, possession, trafficking, administration of prohibited substances, methods of assisting, encouraging, aiding, and covering up of anti-doping rule violations. He received a life ban from all competitive sport, and he had all his results revoked from 1998 until 2012. Stay away from EPO. Next, blood transfusions, also something that Lance Armstrong did. Blood transfusions is a method to artificially boost the blood's oxygen carrying capacity, often through intravenous addition of blood. So basically we're trying to increase the total amount of red blood cells in the blood simply by adding more blood. The goal here obviously is to increase the amount of total hemoglobin, and then we can increase the body's oxygen carrying capacity. Medically, this is used to treat anemia and kidney diseases just like EPO, but it's also used in the hospital in any procedure where a loss of blood is a threat. It's good to have a blood bag of matched blood type right on hand for a quick blood transfusion. But in sports, methods of using blood transfusions is just blood bags. Oftentimes athletes used gravity, and cycling especially. They'd finish the race, go into the team van, boom, hook a blood bag up to the wall behind them and just sit there and let it drip right into their arm, into their vein, and increase their blood in that way. You could have two types of blood transfusions, either autologous or heterologous. But with heterologous we have problems with incompatibility. So not just blood types, but also other sorts of immuno-incompatibilities. There are so many different types of cells in your blood that are unique to you. That's why it's important not to mix blood. Blood bags can be stored in a blood bank for 4 to 5 weeks. Basically, it's a refrigerator at 4 degrees Celsius, or they could be frozen for several years. Other kinds of blood doping, I'll just go through these really quick. HBOCs, those are hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers. They're usually derived from cows or bovine or human hemoglobin. Okay, so again, they're taking the hemoglobin gene, putting it into another animal, and harvesting that hormone that's used, mass harvesting that. Perfluorocarbons, or PFCs, are synthetic chemicals that oxygen can dissolve in, again, increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. EPO mimicking drugs bind those EPO receptors all over the body, specifically in the bone marrow, and then increase the effects that EPO would normally have as well. HCP inhibitors, so HCP is a negative regulatory mechanism on the EPO cascade, and so by inhibiting HCP, we encourage EPO's natural effects. Gene therapy is also something that's really dangerous right now. There's some clinical trials for a drug called Repoxygen, which would insert a gene for EPO into the genome, and then it'd be really hard to detect because there's no way to actually detect some sort of added EPO because your body is actually using the gene to create its own EPO through that therapy. So pretty interesting stuff. Johann Muleg, many of you probably haven't heard of Muleg, but he was a cross-country skier, a German-born Spaniard. He was actually kicked off the German team, won 2 gold medals at the Salt Lake Olympics, revoked because of doping for using a hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier. So testing for blood doping. We do have a few tests for EPO that we can use. The first one would be a direct test. However, this has had many false positives, very costly, and also a really small window in which you can catch an athlete. It's like half a day. And so what's become more common is to use the athlete passport. And in this method, they test an athlete at different times throughout the year, calculate concentration of hemoglobin and the percent of reticulocytes in the blood, and then calculate a score based on that change. If that score is a certain value, the athlete gets busted for doping because of the change over time of their blood. Blood transfusions. Heterologous blood transfusions, we can directly test. Again, looking at those histoincompatibilities between your blood and someone else's, not just blood type. Autologous blood transfusions, however, are much harder. And again, going to be using mostly that athlete passport to figure out if an athlete has been artificially increasing their hemoglobin content in that way. So a take home here for you guys. We focused a lot on the science of doping, but I want you to think a little bit about the ethical considerations of doping. I'm going to leave you with 3 reasons WADA gives for why we shouldn't have doping in our sports. The first, the adverse health effects of performance-enhancing drugs. Second, creating an equal playing field for all athletes, not just elite athletes. And the third, setting an example for the public of a doping-free sport at the highest level of sport. Here my literature cited for you guys. And I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. Let's stay clean.